Hello everyone, and welcome to Dead Carl and You. Today we'll be answering the question, has Russia mobilized? And what are the implications for the answer to this question? The answer is no, Russia has not mobilized, or at least not yet. What do I mean when I say Russia has not mobilized? I mean that Russia has not declared war, nor has it sought to mobilize the sentiment of its population. So there's been no social mobilization. Instead, it's tried to supplement its forces via crypto mobilization, mobilizing people secretly, pressing convicts into service, and pressing Ukrainians in the regions it occupies into service. The decision not to mobilize has been militarily detrimental in that it's undermined Russian morale and has created a chronic shortage of personnel. Russian political leadership has chosen not to mobilize. This is despite the detriments they suffer from refraining to do so. To explain this, we're going to delve into aspects of military theory, specifically those of Clausewitz, to explain why they've chosen to do this. The first of two key elements is Clausewitz's paradoxical trinity of policy, chance, and passion. He considers these the three elements that drive war. So, you might think of it as policy in terms of what the political objectives of a war are, chance, the specifics of what happens on the battlefield, how specific battles go. He considers that ruled more by chance than anything else. And then the final element that drives the course of war is passion. And you can think of this in the very mundane sense, in terms of how people feel, in terms of, morale, in terms of courage, in terms of hatred. And each of these aspects of the Trinity is, in his view, attached to a sub-trinity. Policy corresponds to government, chance corresponds to the military or the army, and then passion corresponds to the people. So each of these is kind of the manifestation or carrier of these other aspects of the Trinity. So in Clausewitz's view, it is this sub-trinity that give war its character in different eras. So the nature of the government, the nature of the military, and the nature of the people, and their role, influence, and disposition are what create the different circumstances of war. From the primary trinity of policy, chance, and passion. Clausewitz, being a man of the 19th century, used the armies of the 18th century as his example. So, the armies of the 18th century are what he refers to, and what we still generally refer to as cabinet armies. These were unpopular armies in the sense that they were not of the people. They were the dregs of society. Essentially, foreigners, people who couldn't do anything else. They were more or less press-ganged into service and used to fight wars without any real attachment to the nation they served. This was a period of dynastic war. France, Prussia, Russia, and Austria each had armies, but these armies were loyal to sovereigns. They were not loyal to the nation itself. They were not of the nation itself, in contrast to a modern army. This is the distinction that Clausewitz draws between the armies of the Napoleonic era and those of the era of Frederick the Great. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution had transformed the relationship between the citizens and the state. No longer were people mere subjects of a sovereign, but they were members of a nation, of an imagined community, which people felt a very strong personal connection for. The intense personal connection to the nation that was brought about by the innovation of nationalism is what brings us back to our Trinity. The passion, the third element that was absent during the Cabinet War, was suddenly brought to the fore in the era of the Napoleonic Wars. The armies of Napoleon were infused with first revolutionary zeal, and then pure nationalistic fervor, and as such were able to sweep away the cabinet armies of the other great powers of Europe. Thus, a central conclusion of Clausewitz is that in the modern era, an army must be national. Without the input of the people, without the driving force of passion, you're left with something that very much resembles a cabinet army of the 18th century. And these cabinet armies do not have the morale to withstand a national army. Now, with that in mind, we can turn our attention to the cases of Ukraine and Russia. If we apply Clausewitz's trinity to the case of Ukraine, we see a classic case of a war of national defense. The people are enthusiastic in defending their homeland. The state has been politically united by the threat to its existence. The army is receiving strong motivation and support from both those quarters as a result, even though it is lacking material and time to recover from its disaster in 2014. Ukraine fulfills all the prerequisites for national modern war, as defined by Clausewitz's trinity. It can field a national army empowered by the forces of a modern state and the passion of a nation in its own defense. In the case of Russia, while mired in corruption, both the state and the army are committed to the campaign in Ukraine. However, undermining these efforts, the Russian people are absent from the equation. This is a key factor. Passion is essential to the prosecution of modern war. People have to care to kill and die for their country. And if you fail to mobilize your population, you're going to suffer the morale and personnel problems the Russians have thus far in Ukraine. Russia can expect to continue to suffer these problems and continue to have lower morale relative to Ukraine until there is a social mobilization in which the passion of the Russian people is engaged. So, to sum up the comparison, while war's nature is unchanging, its form is reflective of the societies that wage it. When there's a weak bond between the people and the state, there's no passion in the prosecution of war, and you end up with cabinet wars and cabinet armies. These cabinet armies are vulnerable to people's armies when there's a strong bond between the state and the people, which is the nation. Now, none of this is particularly secret or uncommon knowledge. In fact, Clausewitz has been required reading in Russian military academies for over a century at this point. The question, then, is why does Russia choose to avoid mobilization, knowing that the element of the people is essential to waging modern war? To answer this question, we'll have to go to Clausewitz's most famous aphorism, that war is nothing more than politics with the addition of other means. What Clausewitz means by this is that war is the addition of the means of violence to the existing political landscape. Existing political processes continue to play out through every phase of war, before, during, and after. Therefore, to understand the decision not to mobilize, we must examine the policies of the Russian government and determine where they conflict with the goal of mobilization. The key element here is the political condition of the population of Russia. The Putin regime has expended considerable political capital in making the Russian population apathetic. This has been done through propaganda and through a bargain of non-interference. The kind of nationalism that the Putin regime presents is a sort of TV nationalism, imperialism for domestic show, where the nation can be seen accomplishing the acts of a great power through one's TV screen in order to make one feel better about the miserable personal circumstances that they might exist in. Putin's kleptocracy has been sustained through a learned, fatalistic acceptance of corruption. This environment is clearly antithetical to national mobilization. People cannot simultaneously be apathetic to the corrupt condition of their government and the poor economic conditions that surround them, and also be burning with nationalist fervor to conquer other countries and die for the glory of empire. Putin has spent decades ensuring that he rules over a depoliticized population. This has largely secured his rule against domestic discontent. However, it precludes him from undertaking a national mobilization. To undertake a national mobilization would mean politicizing the Russian people, a dangerous prospect for a regime secured on apathy. A taste of the consequences of political mobilization may be seen in the attitudes of Russian nationalists and mill bloggers who have been criticizing the Kremlin's efforts in the war and the Ministry of Defense since its inception. National mobilization would increase the power and influence of these nationalist voices and leave the Kremlin vulnerable to popular nationalist movements. Ultimately, then, Russia is faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, no one is willing to fight and die in the name of political apathy. On the other, conducting a national mobilization would mean politicizing the Russian people and undermining the forces that have secured Putin's kleptocracy for decades. That is to say, while mobilization makes it less likely that Russia will lose the war, mobilization also drastically increases the consequences of losing the war. It's conceivable that if Russia does not mobilize and maintains its population in a state of apathy and depoliticization, it can lose the war without significant impact on the regime's security. However, if the Russian people are mobilized into a war fervor, any regime that leads the nation into defeat will be very harshly judged by the politicized population. The ultimate question, then, is whether the Russians will be willing to empower the nationalists, or whether they'll prefer to risk losing the war and rely on the extensive security apparatus and the depoliticized public to weather the political backlash from a defeat.